Sri Yukteswar wrote a book called The Holy Science, which is a very deep book, which I do not pretend to understand. I've read it a couple of times, a few times. Each time I learn a tiny bit more, but I can't by any means be an authority on that book. There is, however, one section in it that I've always been powerfully magnetized by, and that book is Sri Yukteswar at Babaji's request, comparing verses from the Indian scripture and verses from the Bible. So I believe, without even knowing for sure, that this section is where Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And that came in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus gave, in which he talked about how certain attitudes will bring certain results. And Swamiji set that song, those words to music in the Beatitudes, put a beautiful melody to it. So I've heard it repeated over and over again. Those who are grieving will be comforted. Those who thirst after righteousness will be satisfied. That's something I only just noticed a few weeks ago, because we tend to think that those who thirst after righteousness will be forever disappointed. But it's very interesting that the statement is that ultimately that desire for righteousness will be satisfied. But then he says those who have pure hearts will see God, which is everybody gets what they're looking for, but purity of heart brings the vision of God. And it has never exactly seemed like a parallel in the same way that some of the others do. So it always just floats a little bit as a mystery, or as a question to be contemplated and understood on ever deeper levels. So Sri Yukteswar takes this on, and the relevant part here is how he describes, and what he describes, and I believe it's 5, but it doesn't matter, the stages of the purification of the heart, and sort of how we progress. His book is, to say his book is terse is putting it mildly. It's just very epigram, and you have to really get it. But he talks about, as if I remember correctly, the first 3 stages of the heart are when we are, he uses the word propelled. I use the word compelled, which means the same thing, which is there is a force that pushes us that is not necessarily of our choosing, and we do not start it, but nor can we extricate ourselves from it. We are compelled, propelled by the force of our individual spirit desiring to merge with the infinite. And I spoke of this the other night as the way the river, every drop of water on earth heads to the ocean. It's like as soon as the little drop gets here, it starts looking for its destiny, which is to get to the ocean. Even if it's raised up in evaporation, it comes back down later in rain, and then it heads for the ocean. We are, the river seeks the sea. That's what we are. And our individual spirit, the jiva, the Sanskrit word for that, jiva is always longing to merge with its, longing to find its true home. Perfect song that Dambara chose. To find its perfect home, we know we were born for perfect happiness. If we didn't believe we were born for perfect happiness, we would be content to suffer. And it's a very interesting thing to think about. But we always know when we're suffering that something is off. And even if we can't figure out what it is and we can't seem to extricate ourselves from it, we're not content. Just like the river just doesn't say, oh, well, this is too much work to get to the ocean. I think I'll just stop. You know, many of you have been to Kavita's house, and right out the kitchen window, you just watch the river. I've always been fascinated by moving water. And when I was here, one of the times that you took me to that wonderful big waterfall, whatever it's called. Yeah, where you just arrived in a parking lot where there's just a couple of little curio stands, and oh, ye of little faith, wonder why I've been brought all the way here. And then you just go around the corner to the most magnificent waterfall, and narrows, and heading for the sea. And every time I see anything like that, you just, what is the name? So Polka Falls. Polka? Hoka Falls. Okay, so you all know what I'm talking about. It's just one of the wonders of the world, and it's vivid in my mind. Every time I'm there, it's just like, talk about compelled. I mean, the water, it's a narrow spot. It could have said, this is too squishy, I don't want to go through this. But it just forces itself through. And when we speak of ourselves and think of ourselves, the problem is we are so many different levels simultaneously. And this little bit that we think we're in charge of, we're extraordinarily misguided in thinking this tiny bit that we're conscious of is actually the captain of the ship. It isn't at all. There's this other part of it that knows what our true destiny is and will not rest until we reach it. And our destiny is purity of heart so that we can see God. Okay, what is the word? The word purity is kind of an odd word in the way, in our context. Purity means, well, think of it just in terms of like purifying gold, pure gold. There's things in there that are not the same as the gold, and the gold is going to shine better if you can get all those impurities, and they're impure because they're not the same as the essential substance. So our essential substance is divine, is blissful, is free, is not compelled, is able to just live by divine law joyfully and effortlessly. And then there's all these impurities that say, but I would be happier if, I would be happier if, I would be happier if, I would be happier if. And we tend to call that me, but our higher self knows that's not us. So we keep trying to purify ourselves. Whether we know that or not, that's what we're actually doing. So Sri Yukteswar calls it, we're propelled. The heart is not yet pure, and it's propelled to have experiences that will educate us as to what is eternally real, who am I, what is the real source of my suffering, what is the real source of my joy. And we do not learn by somebody making a dogmatic list of what we're supposed to do. It's just, we don't. We might be forced to cooperate. We might be too afraid not to cooperate. We might be, it might be an appropriate instruction for us, and the right karmic experience is to try. But gradually we move step by step. There's a magnificent story. The book is called I Am a Monk, and it was written by John Tetterman is his name. It's a very interesting little book. And he grew up in the Midwest of the United States in a Catholic family. From a very young age, he wanted to be a priest. In his early teen years, he entered a seminary school. He went on to become a Catholic priest. He was brilliant. They highly educated him. He ends up in the Vatican. He has a very high-level position. He loves his life being a priest, and he just throws himself into it with so much energy that he just exhausts himself and has his physical body gives out. So they send him off to Switzerland. He's still a young man, like in his 30s at this point. They send him off to a sanitarium in Switzerland. He's absolutely ordered to do nothing. He's not even allowed to follow the rituals of his order, anything. So he spends day after day sitting on a balcony looking at one of the most beautiful views in the world, and is forced to do nothing for the first time ever. He grew up on a farm in the Midwest. If he wasn't going to school, he was milking cows. He's never sat there. Sitting in those circumstances, he has an experience of Christ. He has a divine revelation. Jesus comes to him in living form. Everything happens. And he realizes that his entire Catholic upbringing is not true. And he never became disenchanted with it. He just realized that the true revelation of Christ is not Catholicism. And he even writes, he said, most Catholics don't know this. He said, but I'm highly educated in it, so I actually know what Catholicism is. And so much to his absolute dismay, he has to resign because integrity demands that he resign. And then just for fun, I'll tell you, I'm certain that he knew Master. He was in Los Angeles in the 1920s, And I believe Amalita Galakuchi, one of Master's well-known disciples, was his friend. He ends up marrying and raising a family. He becomes a movie actor, and he's given the parts of saints and priests. And it's just, he never mentions Master in his memoir, but there's no doubt that Master, he only has this one line, his Master's line, center everywhere, circumference nowhere, which is not actually even original with Master, I found out when I really started to trace that down. But that's the only hint in the book of this. But okay, because his heart could not rest, you see. He was perfectly content, but he could not rest. So Sri Yukteswar writes, we are compelled to be involved with one another. There are 5 stages, I believe. In the first 3 stages, we are forced to constantly be with one another. And we are, generally speaking, we get to suffer from one another because we have to find out what is true and what is not true. We have to find out where our happiness really comes from. And very, 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 you have to be extremely highly advanced before you can continue that process without the compelling force of all the demands that are put upon us. Now, part of the reason I've gone to so much trouble to say this is we have a certain amount of energy to progress, to change ourselves, to learn and expand. And we need every ounce of energy that we have in order to be able to do it. But a tremendous amount of our energy is committed to rebelling against the necessity to do that. You know? And we just want it to be different. Many of you, because you've all listened to recordings, you've heard me say this, but it's still a perfect story. There was a little boy named Michael. He was 3 years old. We had an ashram house. I use the royal we when I speak of Ananda. It's not that I was actually present, but we had a 5-story mansion in San Francisco. In the Pacific Heights, we always live in the best neighborhoods because we like big houses and we're very refined people. Big houses make good ashrams. So we had this beautiful 5-story mansion in this really marvelous neighborhood there, way up on a hill looking over the San Francisco Bay. It was gorgeous. And there was a huge staircase that went up right up the center of the house, the way these houses are built. And the house had a lot of wood, and therefore it had acoustics. It was an acoustic shell, the whole house. So noise in one part would reverberate. And so this little boy was 3, had a tremendous amount of willpower, a lot of energy. He woke up in the morning, early morning, like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. when it was still quite dark. And he was finished sleeping, and nobody else was up, and he did not like this. So he climbed out of his bed and he walked over, because he understood the acoustics of the house. He stood in the stairwell and shouted at the top of his voice. Children can be very loud. "I want it to be morning," he declared like that. Which of course caused a lot of entertainment for him because of the whole, half the house woke up to find out why he's on the stairwell screaming at this time. But I want it to be morning. I mean, how often, maybe we're not 3, maybe we don't have to crawl out of our crib, but ask yourself, how much energy do we spend just saying, I want it to be different? When I went through early in my life, one of the first, of the parade of disappointments, deep. I can't even at this point make light of how I felt. Just total heartbreak. And I realized that my heart was broken because what had existed had ceased to exist. Because everybody in the story had turned the page. Because this happens, doesn't it? We don't stay the same. We start in one place, and even sometimes external events intervene, like death or accidents or everything, but things change. And then it simply doesn't exist. And so I was given to tears, as one is, and I was spending many weeks in a state of great sadness. And then one day I realized that what I wanted, what had been true, had ceased to exist. And no power in heaven or earth could bring the past and make it the present or the future. And therefore, if I was going to weep over that fact, I would never stop crying. Because what would ever make me to stop crying? And it didn't in any way change the way I felt, because I was grief-stricken. But I also just had to ask myself, how do I want to live? And I wasn't sophisticated enough to really understand the metaphysics of these things, but it was just a very practical question. But you see, my higher self was trying to instruct my present self, which is, you can be as mad as you want about reality, but reality always wins. And so at a certain point we have to ask ourselves, well, as my dear friend once asked me, she was a wonderful healer, and I described to her something that I was thinking and doing and so on. And she just so sweetly, she just kind of, looked at my face with all her loving heart and said, "And how is that working for you?" And I had to say, "Not very well." "Well then, how much longer do you want to keep doing it? What do you think is going to happen if you just stand on that stairwell and demand that it be morning?" So there is a point, and this is why we're all involved with each other, because nothing breaks our heart as much as each other. Isn't that so? And it's so annoying. It's just so annoying. My friend from many years ago, when Ananda Village first started, most of us were in our 20s, and there were just a few who to us seemed incredibly old. One man was 50. And this man was, I believe, 65. Whoa. 1 foot in the grave. Okay. But he was a rather distinguished gentleman, and I remember him saying, he liked to pontificate. He said, "The great tragedy of life is that A is in love with B, but B is in love with C, and C is passionate about D." And he said, "And no matter how hard you try, the thing just never straightens itself out." This is the wisdom of the ages that he was presenting. But see, we have the thought in our mind that we're here for it to all be beautiful and easy and pleasurable. I'm just going to sit right where I am, and it's just going to arrange itself around me, and that's what it means that I was made for joy. Is that it all matches, it all fits exactly what I'm shaped like now, and everybody fits right into it. And that's just a fundamental misperception about why we're even here. We're not here to be comfortable and to just get things the way we want. Now, the opposite of that is also false, nor are we here to suffer. This is what the poor Christians did when they made the crucifixion instead of the resurrection, the definition of Christianity. The more you suffer, the more you're like Jesus. That was like a super bad mistake. I was with Swamiji in Europe. We would have been we were in Florence, and we went to the Uffizi, and we looked at a great deal of beautiful religious paintings there. And painting after painting was Jesus on the cross in countless ways. And we came out, and Swamiji, in his simple way, he said, "I think it's time for a new theme," he said. He said, "I think we've taken that one about as far as we need to take it." So the opposite is not that misery is our lot, but we are here to learn. And whether we think learning and changing is miserable or merely challenging, but useful in the end, you see, has nothing to do with the circumstances, it's just how we regard it. But Sri Yukteswar says we are forced through this narrow channel, just like the water in that falls are, because we need to scrape away our misunderstandings so that we can embrace who we really are. So first we have to understand this about everyone. Everybody is on a journey. And everybody is on their own journey. And even if you give birth to the child, what to speak if you merely fall in love and make pledges to one another, everybody is still on the individual journey. Well, about your own children, Swamiji articulated it beautifully when he said, the mother and the father create the physical vehicle for the soul to express its destiny, but the mother and father do not create the soul or its destiny. And that darling little baby, and I love darling little babies, they're just so marvelously fun and adorable little children. That child is a fully formed consciousness, has its full intelligence, its full spiritual realization. It just doesn't have the means to tell you about it. But that doesn't mean it's not experiencing it or expressing it. It's just doing it in an age-appropriate manner. But you are guiding, you have a responsibility, you have a huge responsibility to do the best you can do it for that soul. But you're not creating it. You don't own it. Now, there's more to say to your question about how you should appropriately convey to that child what you have found useful in your life. And I do not feel a hands-off approach is the best way to do it. But there is an appropriate way which has to do with your own understanding of yourself and the world around you. I have, in the course of my many years in community, I've done hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours of counseling, and probably at least half of it is about romantic relationships, because that's what causes us the most grief, isn't it? You know, we just get ourselves into these expectations, and then the darn thing is, in these relationships, there's always two people. And one of them is not me. And you know, it's easy to laugh at that, but it's when that begins to assert itself, and we think that we've been betrayed, we think that somebody didn't keep their promise to us, all these different things, when actually all that happened was, at some point, it becomes self-evident that there's two of us, and that we are not creating each other's destiny. And that even though there may be a tremendous intersection, it's just that. There's an intersection. There's never, when we're talking about incarnated spirits, we're always separate. We're always separate even when we don't have bodies. We're still individual jivas. And every relationship, every single relationship is about friendship. Master says the highest form of love is friendship. And for this reason, and now the ideal, the most obvious ideal relationship is mother love. Because mother love, in its ideal form, is completely without regard for itself. I mean, even the physical body is taken over, and the physical body is sacrificed for the sake of the child. And of course, we're not talking about men and women, we're just talking about an ideal, but it's symbolically manifested. But the mother is compelled to take care of that child. So even whether she wants to or not, the child's life depends on it, and she's compelled to do it. She can do it joyfully, she can do it willingly, but she has to do it. Okay? Friendship, even, and then we get involved in parental to child, you know, parent to child, child to parent, husband to wife. All of these, a form sets in, and that form inevitably involves certain expectations and compelling expectations. The only form of love that is completely free is friendship. You just express it because you want to, or you withdraw it because you want to. And so Master said that's the highest form. That's why last night I was talking about friend being one of the bhavs, and in the Gita, I was speaking of that last night. I believe Krishna calls Arjuna friend. And in the Bible, as I was saying last night, Jesus calls his disciples friend. And there's a very subtle and extremely deep message there. Now, when romance, when sexuality, when passion, when commitment to raise children together all set in, all of these expectations, and I know expectations is a cliche, so just saying that alone is not really solving the problem. But we do get in the position where this is what is supposed to happen, and then when it doesn't happen, we get in war with reality, don't we? And then we start trying to compel the people in our lives to do the things that they are supposed to do. And how's that working for you? You know? How is that working for you? Now, the problem is we get close to people, and when they start behaving badly, it's not merely that we selfishly want them to behave in a different way so that all feel better. We also panic for their sakes. We get really worried that, you're doing the wrong thing. You're going to get bad karma here. You need, however we phrase it, you're going to go to hell forever. You're going to get bad karma. It's all sort of the same thing. But we want them to be different. And we may want them to be different for very strong reasons. But what happens then, we get compelled by the lack of peace in our own hearts. And instead of acting with calm understanding of what might be best, we are compelled. We have compelled hearts. We do not have pure hearts. We do not have free hearts. And so we get to practice. We get to find out what this is. So the fundamental thing we have to understand is dissonance, disharmony, heartbreak, grief, loss. That doesn't mean anything's going wrong. It just means that this is the karma that I was born to face. And yes, part of what we do when we face hard karma is we have to gather our intelligent forces and our willpower to figure out what to do about it. And that's why the karma comes. It's an unlearned lesson. Karma is the best, most useful definition that I know of for the word karma is it's an unlearned lesson. This, whatever it is, has the power to persuade me that life is not joyful, that God does not love me, that things ought to be different than they are, which is not the truth of things. But that truth is so high that just merely to be able to say it doesn't mean that my spontaneous reaction is to learn that. So we get to practice. And part of what that practice is about is we get to experience often just the pit of misery. Just the pit of misery. Because, and this is so unfortunate, until the suffering of continuing as we are looks worse than the effort required to change our attitudes, we will not put out the effort to do it. And it's adjusted to the micron. If I'd rather just continue to suffer and be in grief rather than really face myself, put out the energy, have the humility to admit, to forgive, to do all these other things. I've said the word forgiveness, so let me put that in here at the moment. Personally, I've never liked the word forgiveness, and alternately, Swamiji sometimes speaks for it and sometimes speaks against it, so I have this authority on both sides of this one. Forgiveness is a beautiful word. It's obviously a marvelous concept. But what I don't like about it, and this is what Swami has said at places, is it's I who am forgiving you, because I am magnanimous and I have raised my consciousness to a higher spiritual level, and you, poor misguided twerp that you are, I forgive you. Now, the result of that is to release anger, to stop feeling like I'm a victim. It's to stop feeling that reality has betrayed me, that something has gone wrong. So the result is what we're trying to get. But Swami uses a much more neutral word, which I think is helpful, which is we have to accept the way things are. We just have to accept it. This is what is. Because forgiveness implies that a wrong has been done to me, and now I'm going to magnanimously let it go. But you see, no wrong is ever actually done to us. Opportunities are given to us. But that's not to say that people don't behave badly. Some people behave monstrously. So there's a difference between pretending that everything is just perfect and everybody does just what they're supposed to do, and actually realizing that the way this person behaved is nightmarish. Nobody should be subjected to what I was subjected to. But rest assured, that person's karma is worse than yours. because when dark energy goes through someone and maybe deposited on another, an innocent child or whoever it's deposited on, it's already one step removed, no matter how horrific it is when it lands. Where the real poison takes place is in the person who channels, who becomes a channel for that. Because in order to do many of the horrific things that are done in this world, a person has to open themselves to extraordinary dark energy. You know, to be an abuser of children, to be a sexual predator, to be a torturer of others. And so the trace of the power of the darkness is what they're going to have to deal with. You know, so it's not, we don't have to worry. Retribution will come. But let's think of it differently. They will have the opportunity to learn what is real, what causes suffering, because it's a profound unlearned lesson from them. So why ruin my life? Because they have a hard lesson, right? You can feel great compassion, but we have to just accept that this is what has happened. Now, the next step is that you ask the question, well, why is it happening to me? And the answer is because I have something to learn. And this is very hard. I was saying at breakfast, I had, in this lifetime, I've had a charmed life. But I know when I'm talking to a room full of people, I don't know what's in this room. I don't know what some of you may have been through. And believe me, when I'm saying this to you, I'm not being even slightly glib. I understand this, especially things that happen to us when we're children. You know, when we just don't even understand. But the difficulty with the law of karma is that if it's true anywhere, it has to be true everywhere, which is why very few people want to really accept it. It's especially hard if one feels that I have been the victim. And by any objective standard that our society would look at, you have been. Because you've been subjected to somebody's very, very dark energy. Now, to think that you're being punished is a terrible way to think about it. But to think that there is nothing for you to learn from this experience is a forward-moving, helpful way. And my question is always, you know, how has this made you a better person? What is it that you would not, what good thing would you not have learned if you hadn't been through this experience? That doesn't take you all the way to saying, oh, I'm so glad it happened, but at least it can begin to turn the energy. And so in all our experiences with people, whether we've been betrayed by a lover or somebody has just died and God has just taken away from you that which you were not ready to give up, or you never got something that you really thought you should have, or worse, you got it and it just disappointed you, and now what are you going to do? You know, these are all just, this is life. This is the progress, this is the propelled heart forced into these situations so that we can rise and rise. A woman friend, an acquaintance, she came to our retreat many years ago when I was running the weekend, running a lot of the programs. This would be in the 70s and 80s. And she came all the way from Sweden, which was more unusual at that time. Now people travel more to be in our community because we were the only community at that time. And she came because she had been gifted with a wonderful woman as a sister, her biological sister. They were close in age. They did everything together. They planned that they would marry, they would have children, they would live next door to each other. Everything was all planned. And then in her mid-20s, her sister got cancer and died. And the woman in front of me was just beyond herself with grief. She just didn't know. But as she explained it, she said, I suffered as I had never suffered before. And because I suffered, I prayed as I had never prayed before. And because I prayed with that intensity, I felt the presence of God as I had never felt it before. And as a consequence, she found Autobiography of a Yogi, came from Sweden to California, was there to learn to meditate, to do Kriya, all those things. I took a great risk, but it came out of me to say it. I said, well then, would you say your sister's death was a tragedy or a blessing then? And I mean, she just looked horrified when I said that. But you see, the question had to be asked. Do you think her sister promised her before they were born that she was going to be an enormous catalyst for her growth, and then just kept her promise? I mean, I can't say yes or no, but exactly the same situation. Which side do you look at it from? So when we're working with people, no, because this is where I was going to say a moment ago. When I have done a lot of counseling for a lot of couples, which I don't do anymore, I've done enough, I feel. Occasionally, and it did happen, I would meet a couple that were actually mismatched. The energy just was never going to go anywhere. Most of the time, the majority of time, let's just say, the problem was within each of them. And of course, because they were not at peace with themselves, they found it impossible to be at peace with each other. And to be fair about this, when I say the couple was mismatched, I mean like they were fundamentally, one was a bad person and one wasn't, or something like that. But you could also be very uneven in what I'm just saying, that, you know, my happiness comes because I've made a deliberate decision to be happy. And I may decide that your decision never to be happy is just too much of a drain on my decision to be happy. I'm not, in our present age, separation and divorce is just part of how the story goes. And as Swamiji said, lifelong marriage is not necessarily a victory. You know, sometimes it's just, you know, an exercise in endurance in which nobody wins, right? So please understand. But we are responsible for our own happiness. And nobody can make you happy. And especially romance in our particular time, and to a certain extent the romance of having children, tells us that, oh, if I just do this, then happiness will come with it. And then, because of the way God creates this universe, the miasma comes in, and we just think it's true. We just think it's true. And because our cultures now have no stories, no true stories, no culture does, meaning everybody's idea of how to be a person comes from fictional sources, generally created by people who don't have very high consciousness. Movies, novels, romantic music, television shows, pornography. I mean, and this is how people build their character. And then they go out and they try to make fiction work. You know, I had this one woman tell me, oh, I want a relationship just like, and then she mentioned this movie. And I mean, I just looked at her, I said, that's fiction. And I even had to say, it wasn't even good art, you know? It's like, honey, you are doomed. You know, you were really doomed. It's never going to happen like that. You know, at least the Indian culture is now just joining the general tide toward chaos and collapse, but they at least have had the epics for a long time, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and I've had my Indian friends just explain things to me in terms of Lord Brahma and what he did, and then how Shiva related to Parvati, because their culture, and Master writes this in Autobiography of a Yogi, my mother, you know, conveniently pulled from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the stories of the gods and goddesses for the necessary moral lesson. In other words, their character was being formed by this very elevated. And in India today, you see it's a tremendous mixed culture, but you still find those who are really formed by those high ideals. And in my life experience, when you meet a person of Indian origin who the only word I can use is a true Indian, it's a remarkable character that you rarely see anywhere else in the world. But it's not all pervasive anymore. And my fun of going to India these days is sooner or later, less so now, but I started going there 40 years ago. True Indians at some point when they felt comfortable with us would say something like, most of the people here are not really Indians. I don't know where they came from. And Master says that too. Just we're mixing up the world right now, and it's true. But character being formed by noble stories is quite different than the world we live in. Right. So there's much more that one can say, but I don't want to take the whole thing. But you understand. Wait, pause for just a second. Oh, I'm going to go back. I want to finish this thought. We have to start by understanding that if I don't make myself happy, nobody will ever be able to make me happy. And I must bring into every friendship and every relationship I have to bring somebody into that relationship, meaning me. Because if I really bring myself with clear values, a clear understanding of we can be wonderful friends, friends are wonderful. And marriage itself is just a unique kind of friendship with a unique challenge because of the great danger of overfamiliarity. That's what ruins relationships, is overfamiliarity. We just get used to each other. We begin to think of each other as an extension of each other's mind. We stop appreciating. I'm going to embarrass Dambara slightly because he's somewhat over there. I realized when Dambara and I started traveling together, especially in airports, people assumed we were married, but we're not, and never have been. He has a beautiful wife. And one of the things that I appreciate about them, and I've known him for a long time, in fact, they noticed each other in a gathering in my living room. And there was just something happened in the room, and I thought, wow. And it did. They told me later, yeah, that's exactly what happened. They just sort of, wow, look at that. But what I've observed about them all these years is they're always so happy to see each other. Just something as simple as that. Every time, no matter whether it's just been a day or when she graciously lends him to me for these journeys, and I have consciously been aware of that. I've never seen them reunite, no matter how brief the separation, without this, there you are. You just think about that. Think about everything that means. It's just that we're constantly, we don't own each other. Everybody has their own destiny, and we're always interested in each other's destiny, even if it contradicts a little with mine. But bear in mind, a friend also takes on what is the reality of the friend. That's why Jesus said, I call you friend, not servant, not disciple. Because a friend, so don't think for a moment that you have the freedom to just follow your own karma. When you partner yourself, when you have children, when Swami created the Nayaswami order, there's what we might call a postulant level to being a Nayaswami for couples. But he said he wouldn't allow anyone who was raising children to be part of that. He said, because you can't take a vow that might contradict the karma of your children. It's not fair. Once you've had those children, your first responsibility is to their destiny, not to your own. And when you take on a partner, you don't have the freedom of your own karma anymore. Which is why lots of us are unmarried. Because then my karma's enough. But I've lived through the other. I understand it. It has a tremendous capacity to help you purify your heart. But when it starts working, don't think it's going wrong. But respond to it. There's something more I have to learn here about how to be a true friend and how to really help. And sometimes what you have to learn is, I've done enough. It's not like you can't ask them to sacrifice their destiny. I'm not talking about parents and children, that's very different. But friend to friend, you can't ask them to sacrifice your destiny, but nor should you sacrifice your own. You are not more important than the people you love, but nor are you less important. And that's where it gets very, very tricky. And is it easy? Oh, heavens, no. Does it eventually give us the capacity to see God By purifying our hearts, yes. That's called the pearl of great price. And what is that price? Courage, 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 courage. Honesty, humility, discipline. But the other question is, do you have an alternative that's going to work better? We can just stand in the stairway and demand that the sun rise hours before it's going to rise, and we can just do that for as many incarnations as we want to. Divine Mother gives us free will. And you know, my Devi, Jyotish and Devi, they have a grown son now. He's 50 or something, but when he was a little child, he was very willful. He was a very independent little boy, and he didn't like being a child because he wanted freedom. So he had tantrums and things like that. And one time he was having a tantrum, and Devi is a very good mother. She, just took him into his room, put him in his room, and she shut the door and, just, you can have your tantrum when you're done. We'll talk about it. So she hears him having his tantrum. Then he stops, and she opens the door, and she says, "Honey, are you done?" And he says, "Not quite, Mommy." Then she shuts the door, and he rages around a little bit longer. I love that. That's how it is, isn't it? Are you done? Not quite, Mommy. But then when we're really ready to work, now, here's the hard part. It's hard. And grief is real, and heartbreak is real. And when you read a thick book and you have different chapters, very often there's a lot of chapters that don't end well. And so the other thing that we hold in our minds is that every piece has to end well, but it doesn't. If you just look around, you see many, 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 many things are unresolved. The incarnation ends and it's not resolved. You never really get your mother to understand your point of view. You never really get the one true love of your life back in your life. You never really get to have the children you wanted to have. But at the end of the book, all of those lessons resolve themselves. So the comfort, and it's small comfort, I admit, is that if it's not the happy ending, it's not yet the ending. Those who thirst after righteousness will be satisfied. But there's no timeline on that promise. And this is where reincarnation is both essential and I find a great comfort. We just push the story as far as we can push it. I was in a situation once where I had this really hard karma with someone, and then I was going to be relieved of the circumstances. And Swamiji said to me, well, perhaps the karma is over, like that. And he let me have that he let me enjoy that for about 10 seconds, maybe even as long as that. Yippee! And then he said, but I don't think so. But then he said what was very interesting. He said, but you've taken it as far as you can take it. It's like this chapter is just going to stop here. And he said, you just have you have to grow in other ways before you're going to be able to deal with this. See, so one of the things that happens through human relationships is humility. I'm not that good. And that itself, you see, is a huge learning. I'm just not that good. In theory, a person should be able to master this, but not this person. You have to grow in other ways. And he said, and don't worry, in this lifetime or in a future lifetime, it'll come back and you'll have a chance. Or he said, if you figure it out, and the other person doesn't, then they get to work it out with a surrogate. You're not going to be compelled by their ignorance. They'll have to learn the lesson, but not necessarily with you. Very comforting, isn't it? Yeah. So the only thing is, and don't even pretend for a minute that that you will never love again, regardless of why you think you're not going to. You will, because you will be compelled. Your heart will compel you. The river wants to get to the ocean, and it'll just keep pushing. And there we go. I was asked a specific question about grief, and I want to touch that before I finish here. Grief to me is fascinating. Especially what I don't understand is the relationship between time and grief. Because when you're grieving, you feel that you'll never recover. A wonderful definition of grief, which is not mine, but is brilliant. Grief is great love with no way to express it. Wow, isn't that just exactly what it is? But the origin point of grief is unexpressed love. Either stopped by betrayal, stopped by death, stopped by changed karma. Okay? But time somehow mitigates the intensity of that. Not that you still can't burst into tears 25 years later, but you won't be crying all the time. I think it's simply that other more vivid impressions come in front of you, because it's not like the essential heartbreak ever stops, but you come to accept it. This is the way I'm shaped. And also more deeply, you may realize, as many people do, I wouldn't be the person that I am, and meaning in a positive way, if this hadn't happened. So is it a curse or is it a blessing? I don't know. But the other thing about grief is, this is the way we're made. I was saying at breakfast, when Yogananda's most advanced female disciple, Sister Gyanamata, died, Yogananda said, I saw her merge into the infinite light. I mean, what could be more magnificent than that? He knew she was free. But when he conducted her funeral, he wept. And he exclaimed, oh, Yogananda and sister, we will never be Yogananda and sister again. And then tears ran down his face, because something beautiful was over. And that's just how we feel. You know, we know that eternity exists, and we mourn when things evaporate. But he knew that she was free. So we are all these things at the same time. And even stranger is the more unusual, is the story of Sri Ramakrishna, an avatar of the late 1800s in India. He lived in the Kali temple near Dakshineshwar outside of Calcutta. And he was a very, very odd and unusual incarnation. And he was a priest in this temple, and he lived there, and his nephew, Hridai, took care of him because he needed to be taken care of. He couldn't relate to this world sufficiently. So Hridai was his caregiver and his companion for many years. And then Hridai became ill and died. And Ramakrishna was there, and he took Hridai's spirit out of his body and, sent it into the light. So then Ramakrishna's there, and Hridai has died. And Ramakrishna was very childlike in the way he expressed himself, just sobbing uncontrollably. Oh, my best friend Hridai is gone. Who will bring me my tea in the morning? Who will sit with me and watch the sunrise? Who will talk to me about the scriptures? Who will walk by the Ganges with me? And he would just sob and sob. And then, just like that, without there being any transition, he would start dancing in ecstasy and talk about watching Hridai's spirit rise up into the light, and now he's free. And then, without any transition, he would be weeping again. So all of it happens at the same time. We can know that there's a divine plan, and yet we can be just so moved by the humanness of it. Very, very odd. And it's important to be humble in all of this and not think that we're doing it wrong. We're not doing it wrong. This is oddly and weirdly just the way it happens. And the more we can feel the river going to the sea and not think that we're making some mistake because we're riding all those waves, the sooner the heart becomes purified, and the sooner we won't have to do this anymore. Or we can do it in such a way as to serve others and not really, we won't be compelled. That's the word that I use. I say sometimes, my mother, I don't care what my future lives are like. I don't care how you want me to live. I just want to be free to follow your will and not be compelled by so many unlearned lessons. So that's what we're asking for, not to avoid them. A priest in Chicago, I read this statement, he's being canonized by the church or something. Father Solano is his name. He said, pray not for tasks equal to your strength, pray for the strength equal to your tasks. Isn't that obvious? So what you say to Divine Mother is, all right, it's okay if you send this to me, but you've got to send me the power to do it. Because, well, I've had this prayer, because we're going down here, Mother. We're just sinking. We're going down for the third time. Okay, I'm going to offer you the Piglet prayer before I leave, and then we'll take a break. The Winnie the Pooh, one of the characters is Piglet, and Piglet is a gutsy little character, but he's also a little smaller than Pooh's stalwart determination or Christopher Robin's skill. So Pooh and Piglet wander off. They go on an expedition, and they wander off, and then the fog sets in, and they find themselves lost. And they're just lost in the fog, and they don't know what to do, and they're having trouble. And Pooh is trying to be brave, to go forward, and then in the little illustration, Piglet just sits down and puts his head on his arm like this. And then Piglet manages to just master himself enough to lift his head and say, help, help, help! And he goes down again like that. Ever since I read that story, the Piglet prayer has always been very important to me. And I'm telling you as a joke, but it's a really serious thing. When all else fails, offer the Piglet prayer, which is I can just pull my head up for a split second, and in the second I pull my head up, help, help, help. Now, of course, the way the story ended was they were about 6 feet away from their friends, but they were lost in the fog. And when Piglet said, help, 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 their friends heard them and just came and got them. Because if it's not the happy ending, it's not the ending. Okay? Everything here is a symbol of something much deeper and greater. That's how Swami put it. It's very hard to really appreciate that, because this world feels so big. We think it's the thing and that the inner world is the symbol, but it's the opposite. And we can't. Sometimes people try to be detached. When Ross was mentioning, it was you, about the Gita being confusing. What mostly happens when people read the Gita is it talks about detachment, and people decide, oh, well, I'll be detached. But what it means to be detached for most people is that I'll just close my heart up a little bit. And then I'll call that detached, because I'm not so vulnerable anymore, so therefore that must be what the Gita is talking about. But that's why the saints come into the world, because the saints are 100% open-hearted, and they actually feel this world much more deeply than the rest of us, because they have an unlimited capacity to feel it. We're wildly protected and selective, but the masters are not at all protected or selective. They just experience the whole of it. But they experience what's on the other side of it simultaneously. And so the word that's an important word is detachment is not a lack of commitment. And the masters, Swamiji was so committed. He just worked so hard every day to create Ananda, to help us, to write books, to write music, to just every single day, 100% of his energy, whatever he could do to help the world, he did it. He wasn't the least bit detached in the sense of uninvolved or uncommitted. Where he was detached was that he was doing it because his guru asked him to do it. And so he was just following the divine flow as it was given to him. And what he was profoundly attached to was following what Master had given him. Master had told him he had a great work to do, and he had to do it. Whether it succeeded or didn't succeed, but part of what he had to do was to try as hard as he could to make it succeed. Because what causes us to fail is usually our lack of courage, our lack of energy, our lack of creativity, our lack of commitment. And in order to strive to succeed, we develop courage, creativity, and commitment. And that's why God asks us to do these things. So it all works, but it's a different story than the story we think. But Swami was extremely tender-hearted. And when things didn't go as he had hoped they would go, he grieved, often very deeply. He was not above it. But he said he didn't grieve for himself. He grieved that something beautiful could have happened and people could have been helped, but it wasn't going to happen. And that was the sadness of it. You see, it's the my happiness depends on what happens outside me. That's what we have to overcome. We have to, someone used the phrase, seek our solace within ourselves. That was what you said. I wrote that down because that's exactly right. And what often breaks up relationships is that, friendships too, and parents and children, is that somebody else is making their happiness dependent on your actions. I can probably say it without crying, but I'm not sure. I left home at 18. I never really lived with my parents again. My father and I were very close, but he hoped, he didn't try to force me, but he hoped that I would live a life that was more involved with him. And I didn't. And I vividly remember when he realized that was what was going to happen. I still can hardly think of it. But I couldn't. I just couldn't. And oftentimes, close things break up because one or the other suddenly realizes, you've made me responsible for your happiness. And that's simply not a responsibility I can take. And it's not, you see, sometimes we think that there's a conflict between loving people and loving God. But that's not true. Because God loves us more than anyone loves us. And if we're going to be an instrument of the divine, we have to love everyone. In fact, we have to be everyone. But that's given selflessly from the divine. It's just the nature, it's our nature to love. But when our happiness, our giving, is conditioned on certain responses from you that are going to make me happy, that is totally unfair. And either the person you've entrapped in that way, it doesn't have to be marriage, it can be friendship, it can be all kinds of things. And it's especially hard between parents and children. I remember I had this vantage point up the hill at a certain point at Ananda Village, and I was sitting on a porch having lunch, and I watched a friend of mine and his little daughter, and there was like about a 25-yard space. He pulled up in his car, he got out of his car. She was a beautiful little 5-year-old. She saw him, and as children are, she starts screaming across the distance, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." She races across and just launches herself into his arms, knowing full well he'll catch her. I thought, how can a man not grow to depend on that? You know? But what God is trying to teach us is the joy of love. It's trying to teach us what it feels like to really love. I had this odd karma. I had 2 women friends. I say they were both friends. One of them was the dearest sister I've ever had in my life. And the other one, we were united by our spiritual aspiration, and we loathed one another. We absolutely could not get along. Absolutely terrible. And much of the time that I was with Swami, I was with both of them at the same time. It was wild. And I was just beginning on the path, and I knew I should be even-minded and cheerful, and I was anything but cheerful in regard to the second. We eventually worked it out, but took years. And so I said to Swami, "Sir, the problem is not really that I dislike this one so much. The problem is that I love this one too much. So if I love this one less, then there would be less of a contrast." You know, just like... But anyway, it seemed like a good idea at the time. He said this to me, I think he said this to me a couple of times over 40 years, but this was the first time. "That is the stupidest idea I've ever heard." He said, great love is given to us to show us what we're capable of, and to show us the joy of loving that completely. But it's to bring everything else up to that level. And so watching my friend and his daughter, and the degree to which he wholeheartedly gave himself to her, what he would gradually understand was it wasn't the daughter that made him happy. It was the love he allowed to flow through him because she was such a magnet for him. And often people who are afraid of their peers are not afraid of their children. But then it's not the actual answer. So as my father wisely put it, the child disappears into the adult. And if you're lucky and you're not only parent and child, but you're also actually friends, it might continue or it just might be done. But it's not because it's wrong, but it's because it's meant to teach us something else.
Baby Tim's in the nursery, asleep in his playpen, his calico pony close by. It's all set if a dream calls to carry its master away to a calico sky. And I sit by my window and wonder why it's only in dreams we can fly. Why a pony can't hurdle the sunset. Maybe that's what makes small babies cry. Daddy sits in his study and hums with his reading the tune of his favorite song. He tells me his homework seems nicer and lighter with music to lift it along. And I sit by my window and wonder why a book has no song of its own, why the world doesn't flood us with music, and why people must sing all alone. Mommy's out in the kitchen, she's making our dinner. I hear by the clink of the pans that she's happy just cooking and knowing. I get choked up. Okay. That she's happy just cooking and knowing we're near her. Her happiness flows. You gotta help me out here. Her happiness flows from her hands. So you keep singing if I can't, okay? That she's happy just cooking and knowing we're near her. Her happiness flows from her hands. And I sit by my window and wonder how the world without mothers would be. And if people could live without loving, such a world I hope never to see. Okay, thanks.